A great site to use to look at the different waves of immigration that's happened historically in the United States. There's been two main waves. Is a site called the Immigration Explorer from the New York Times, which was made March 10th, 2009. So just Google Immigration Explorer, you can find it quite quickly. Go ahead and explain the map. Up here at the top we have the timeline, so 1880, and then we can move the map through historical eras all the way up to 2000. Over here on the right hand side we have the legend or the key. So Canada, so immigrants from Canada are going to be showcased in green. So counties that have a dominant population from Canada are green. Counties that have been dominated by population from Western Europe, those are going to be, for example, England, Ireland, France, Norway, Sweden, are going to be shaded purple. Those from Asia and the Middle East are going to be shown in orange. Those from Latin America are going to be showcased as red or maroon. Those from Russia and Eastern European countries, so Eastern Europe is going to, in this case, include Germany, although I wouldn't normally include Germany with Eastern Europe. Historically, maybe, but today, definitely not. And then finally, Africa there in purple. So what we can do is we can look at different eras and look at these different waves. And so just by looking at 1880 and comparing it to 2000, you can see a much different pattern. Of course, more blues and purples up to the north and the east in 1880, and in this case, the reds and the oranges dominate more into the southern and western parts of the country. Further, we can also look at different data. And so right now we're looking at percent of population in each county, which just look at total number of residents. And now we stick with the same color pattern, same legend, same key, but now we use a proportional symbol map. And so it's another way to showcase the differences over time. So once again, 1880 to 2000, a much bigger difference. In 1880, we see the dominant group, which is going to be definitely the purples and the blues, the Europeans. In particular, we're going to see the English, the Irish, but overwhelmingly the Germans. So the English, we'll go ahead and we'll look at their pattern, and it makes sense we're going to see a large number of English migrants to the United States because that's obviously where we came from. So we see, up until 1840, really, all immigrants to the United States were English, besides, of course, the forced and mass migrants from Africa. So we look at the dominant group for much of the 1800s, we're going to see, of course, being the English, but that changes there in about the 1840s and 1850s. So the same reasons, same push factors and pull factors going on in England. Of course, the British Agricultural Revolution taking hold, so people started having trouble finding jobs in urban areas, became shortages of land. We have this big, huge mass country, land area, the New World in particular, what would become the United States, and so then you see the large out-migration, then subsequent in-migration to this area of the world. And then over time, of course, you get chain migration, then starts to cause the migration to change. And we can see the reason for the dots way out in the west is the gold rush would be one example. Just this essentially the opening up of the west, which happened over time throughout the 1800s. But the big groups we really look at when we look at the first mass migration, the first wave, are the Irish and the Germans. And so the Irish, we can see them overwhelmingly there in what we think of as Boston, down to Washington as the Boss Wash. Particularly New York City, Philadelphia, but also much of the Mid-Atlantic, New England, and Midwest areas, and so also Chicago and St. Louis and Cincinnati as well. And so the Irish there, major push factor. So push factor being the Irish potato famine, which happened in the 1840s. And so that makes sense that we're going to see this group still in large numbers here in 1880. And so this reflects changes that have happened since probably 1840, in which we see the presence of the Irish migration. Then over time, of course, westward migration combined with chain migration continues to sustain these larger numbers. So a major push factor combined with a pull factor, job opportunities. And so the Industrial Revolution really starting to take hold, but also here in the United States as well. You see then the Germans. The Germans is the biggest group we really see, and they call this, in this particular case, the New York Times calls them Eastern European. I would refer to them today as more Western European, but nonetheless, you see the Germans, and this makes sense because we see a large German population in the Midwest, especially here in Indiana. And so anywhere where you're going to see Irish festivals or German festivals, you're going to see the legacy probably from these migration streams. And so Chicago has a large Irish festival, large Irish presence. So does you see large German presence there as well. And so this, you can see the old national road. So a large number of Germans settled in the eastern part of the United States along the coast, but then over time migrated using a particular transportation network, the old national road, and moved from Pennsylvania to Ohio to Indiana to Illinois, and that explains why we see a large number of Germans historically, but also currently in Indiana today. We go ahead and we fast forward to 1890. You can see that was where we really see the largest in-migration of Germans would be probably there representing the 1880s. Another group you see large numbers in the 1880s would be the Norwegians. You see them settling more there in the upper Great Lakes or the northern Great Plains, and so those areas more in the northern Midwest, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota overwhelmingly. And this makes sense if you think about climate-wise. Norway and Sweden are a little bit more north of Germany, and so it makes sense that they also settled more north of Germans. In the case of the Norwegians and the Swedish, as I'll look at next, they came through via Quebec, came through via the Great Salt Lake, the St. Lawrence Seaway, came through the Great Lakes to get to this particular area, unlike the others that overwhelmingly came through New York City and the Atlantic coast. There, when we think about the Mid-Atlantic and New England, these actually came through Canada to get to this area of the world. But the reasons the Norwegians left, just like many of the Swedes left, is because there became too much overpopulation. So then an outcome of the British Agricultural Revolution was huge population growth. Further became land shortages. And so then people said, yep, we got to go somewhere. Add to that some bad climates, some bad drought periods, and then boom, it's going to be push factors to come to the United States. Pull factors would be the fact that we had something called the Homestead Act in the United States. So essentially we're giving away land in much of the western part of the United States, trying to open it to development. And so we're giving away land, and so it makes sense why people would want to move to an area where they were having land shortages. So that is we can see the push and pull factors at the time. So also, like I said, with the Swedes, we can see a similar pattern. Swedes a little bit more dispersed than the Norwegians, but both of these groups have larger prevalence of practicing the Lutheran faith. And so when we see Lutheran churches, we see them in a large percentage in the same area. And so once again, you can see how people, when they move, when they relocate to new places, we can see relocation diffusion, in which they bring with them their particular form of religion, in this case Lutheran. And so this explains this large group there. So we can see 1890, more of an Eastern European change going forward. And so going forward, we'll go ahead and we'll look at the Italians. So the Italians in 1890, not much, but then 1900, 1910, boom, you can see the Italians in larger numbers. And so there you see a lot of pull factors, a lot of economic opportunities, but something we'll really focus in on the Italians going forward, but they had a large return migration with a large number going back to Italy. But we can see a large presence there in the Mid-Atlantic, in New York City in particular. So if we go ahead and we look at all countries, we can see these changes. If I go back to 1900, you can look at Hawaii. So Hawaii is orange. So Hawaii, why is it orange? Japanese migration. So this has been, for the most part, European of origin, but we can see little examples of Asian migration, but that's really not technically part of the United States at the time. Hawaii became a state a little bit later on. We also see the green. The green up there represent Canadians, and those are going to be mostly French Canadians coming from Quebec. So these are mostly French Canadians, and this is largely, industrial revolution, job opportunities. And so while manufacturing was really starting to thrive, this then lured people in because it provided economic opportunities. And so you can see that in large numbers in those particular areas, particularly in the Great Lakes and in the Mid-Atlantic and New England areas. So the common theme with all these different groups, these different European groups, is the fact that the people who were migrating were historically males, and oftentimes they would bring their families, but historically it was mostly males, and they're going there to work for industrial revolution opportunities that were found overwhelmingly in the northern parts of the country, the northern and eastern parts. So we think about these individuals, they also typically were just below the middle income, and so you had to have some money to get across the big ocean, but there's a reason why you're leaving, and so there was often religious reasons, but also, like I've mentioned beforehand, economic reasons overwhelmingly, and so that's what drove a lot of the migrants that I've been talking about. Further, once these individuals got here, they were often, the newcomers, the new people. And so they are often pushed to the least desirable areas, had the least desirable jobs, and so oftentimes you see the most new, the newest group to migrate often gets, persecuted or shunned, as kind of outcasts, or those people have moved in here, now we're going to have to leave. And so you start to get this first wave, starts getting some animosities and some tensions in a lot of these urban areas as these new groups continue to move into these large urban areas already. But let's go ahead and take a look at another group. Let's go ahead and look at the Russians. So the Russians, really see them in late 1800s, but they're really early in the 1900s. You really can see their growth as they go from 1900 to 1910. So a lot of these are actually Jews. So a lot of Russian Jews, and I'm not going to explain as far as the whole reason why they left. They were just essentially being persecuted, they're essentially trying to be wiped out. So that's enough reason to leave. So these Jews found a nice location, a pull factor, being a place of religious freedom, religious tolerance, the good US of A. And so they settled overwhelmingly there along the East Coast, but also there in Chicago. You can see a large number of those Russian Jews. You also see large numbers in rural areas. In particular, you'll find it, in Nebraska, Kansas, a large numbers of Russians. And so, we see one example is today. They've got, I don't know if you've ever been to White Castle, but they got a sandwich that kind of tastes like a White Castle, but it's much bigger. It's got that nice patty, those onions, so good for you. But they've got a burger, kind of a sandwich that's a kind of a German-Russian fusion. And it makes sense. You got a lot of Germans who settled this area, combined with a lot of Russians in this area. It's called a Runza burger. So if you ever get out to Omaha, Nebraska, try a Runza burger. R-U-N-Z-A. Very, very good. It's like a White Castle, but only much bigger. So here we can see the Russians over time. But another group, the Polish. And so if you're a Polish ancestry, you'll find that the 1900s overwhelmingly see a large number of Poles. You see big time there in Chicago and Pennsylvania. So 1900, there's no data for 1910. So we go to 1920, you can really see, boom, the large numbers of Poles. And that's, once again, economic reasons. So you see, large population growth. Land shortages, combined with there's a good amount of Jewish population there in Poland, were all reasons for people to leave and then come to the United States because of the Industrial Revolution. And we had all these industries that are thriving and attracting people that were historically male, just below middle income, to the United States to live. And all of these groups, for the most part, would settle in ethnic neighborhoods. And so we see this. Little Italy. We'll see Polish sections of these large urban areas in New York City or in Chicago. And so you start to see these ethnic enclaves within urban areas develop as you have all these individual groups over time coming to the United States and leaving their impact, bringing with them via relocation, diffusion, their culture, and then, of course, that's going to influence these particular areas. Now I'm going to go ahead and go back to the all countries view. And we see 1920. You can see a little bit of down the southern border. Of course, you're going to see some Latin American migration. That makes sense. These borders, as we'll talk about later on in the chapters, they're not going to be clearly defining as far as separating different particular groups from migrating across them. And so you're going to see a lot of overlap across a lot of borders throughout the world. So that makes sense. And I'm not going to get into the Spanish-American War and all that either, but that also helps explain why we have historically a large number of Latin Americans that lived in that particular area. But anyway, we'll go ahead and we'll go through the Roaring 20s, and we see a particular pattern. So 1930 then is the start of the Great Depression, and so we're going to see the 1930s not a good period, and so subsequently we're going to see a decline, particularly there in the Rust Belt or the Great Lakes and the northern northeast and the North Atlantic coast. Then we see 1940s, of course, World War II is taking place, and so the moral of the story is we see a decline in the migration to the United States, especially there from Europe, but all throughout the world, and it makes sense because of economic reasons why people migrate, and we had a Great Depression, and so the name depression doesn't really sound like a good thing. Combined with a world war, we're not going to see a lot of migration because of that. So that causes kind of this change, and then we'll see the next wave being heavily Latin American and Asian.